the Fantasy Basketball Podcast. This is an exciting day for us, for sure. This has been something that's been in the works for a long, long time. Hopefully, after you listen to the show, you'll recognize that we've put in a little bit of work, that's for sure. I'm going to introduce myself here first, and then I'll introduce or have my co-host introduce himself. So I'm Ken Kelly, and I'm not new to the fantasy realm. So some buddies and I, we started up Dynasty League Football way back in 2006, and it has become the world's largest resource for Dynasty fantasy football information and analysis. It's been a super fun ride. I've been in the fantasy space for 16, 17 years now, and it's been great. But I've always had kind of this itch to really get into fantasy basketball. I'm a basketball coach out of high school. I'm somebody who just really, really loves the game, loves the fantasy aspect of it. I'm just kind of a junkie when it comes to basketball. So I always felt like this was going to be something that would really kind of come naturally to me. So I'm excited to be able to do this. It's been kind of a long time coming. And my co-host is somebody who is more than qualified and somebody who you guys are going to really, really enjoy. So, James, Big Game James, how are you?
Ahoy. I'm doing swell. I'm excited to get this thing kicked off. It's that simultaneous pairing of Excel spreadsheets and statistic nerds like myself and a game of basketball that I love. They come together harmoniously in a symphony of fantasy, similar to the Labyrinth. I feel like David Bowie rotating my orbs as I look through today's top 15 point guards, and I can't wait for the season to get here, to be honest with you. I've been playing fantasy basketball for 15 years plus, actually a little bit longer than that. I've been going back to the days where you didn't have the luxury of apps. You actually pulled out the daily newspaper and you wrote your stats down on a graphing sheet and did your own calculations. So, the game has really evolved. Technology's evolved, which has made it easier, but in some ways not as much fun. But I think that, between ourselves and, your standard ADP websites, we're going to bring, a little spicy meatball to this fantasy world, and I'm ready to kick it off.
Well, I just think that you already dropping the words labyrinth and orb have probably already got us started on the right foot here. So yeah, the thesaurus that is James Fraley is ready to rock here for sure. So a little bit about
the orb. The orb was the original fidget spinner.
What do you mean?
That's the truth. Well, if you think about what kids did when they would like fidget, right? Do you remember having baseballs and you would just do? Did you ever do the labyrinth orb spin?
I'm familiar with a baseball, yes, but I never hey, do you want to go out and throw the orb? I never said that to anybody in my life.
I just ran in different clans, I guess.
Yes, for sure. You guys played orb ball when I was watching basketball and thinking about fantasy for sure. So, as you guys can tell already, we're a pretty laid back crew here. Let's talk a little bit about what we're going to do. So over the span of the next 4 episodes here, it's going to be a series. So it's going to really lead us into fantasy basketball drafting series. We're going to talk about consensus rankings for point guards, shooting guards, forwards, and centers. We're going to go ahead and use some consensus rankings from Fantasy Pros, from Yahoo, and then our own rankings. We're going to come up with a formula. I'm sure you're going to come up with some type of weird, crazy name for what we're going to do. We're going to shake the orb. It's going to basically produce some type of order for us. It's going to be some type of consensus, and we're going to cover those players. Today we're going to do point guards, all right? So it's going to be using standard 9-cat scoring models. Picks are going to be pretty consistent across most seasonal formats. I mean, certainly you can make some adjustments here and there. And just to reinforce to those people listening out there, we are not two people who are going to jump on this podcast and, tell you what to do. Our job is to give you analysis and information and opinion, and then really give you guys kind of those tools in the toolbox for you to be successful. So we're going to be wrong. We're going to be right. There are going to be mistakes that we make along the way. There are going to be some things that we hit on too, but it's going to be an entertaining show. It's going to be fun. And I think it's going to be something that's going to be some value for everybody each and every week. So normally we'd start here with some breaking fantasy news. There really isn't anything this week that's huge. So I think we can go ahead and just jump into our top 15 fantasy point guards for 2022-23. James, are you ready to rock?
I was born ready, Kenneth.
You're born. Okay. All right. So let's get into some honorable mentions first. And there are a few here, okay? So these are the ones who did not make our top 15. So I guess we'll probably send them like a ribbon in the mail or something, or like a handwritten note saying, I'm sorry you didn't make, the Fantasy Basketball Podcast top 15, but here's a box of chocolates or something like that.
Yeah, I'm definitely a Sherry's Berries guy, so I'd like to fast track a couple of those packets off to the following gentlemen, starting with Colin Sexton of the Utah Jazz. Look, I think we're starting off hot, and I was looking for a way to try to get him in my my top 15. He actually was in my top 15, but last year, great splits, 45% field goal shooting, 24% behind the 3-point line. Definitely, room for improvement there. 74% from the line, 16 points, 3.3 rebounds, 2.1 assists, just under 1 steal. Never blocked a shot, which I find just very difficult given his energy, and 2.3 turnovers. Injured much of last season. He moved over to the Jazz in the big Donovan Mitchell trade earlier this year. And from a fantasy perspective, I think it's pretty safe to assume that Utah's on that race to the first pick in next year's draft. So from a usage standpoint, Colin should get a lot of touches. I think that he brings great energy, and I think that Utah is actually looking to kind of solidify him as one of the pieces moving forward, as evidence of that contract that they gave him when they signed him or brought him over. So I definitely think, from a day one perspective, he should be pretty impactful.
Well, it's crazy because we as fantasy managers have really poor memories. And, we haven't seen Sexton play for quite some time now. But when he played those years in Cleveland, he was dynamic. And I understand that Donovan Mitchell is a fantastic player. I get the trade. Utah is certainly rebuilding. I would expect them to move some of their other veterans here shortly, whether it's Conley or Clarkson or whoever else. And that's just going to free up more time for Sexton as well. But I really like him in Utah. I think that he's in there for the long haul, signed an extension, should be a starter day one, and a lot of that offense is going to go through him. So he's one of those guys who may fly under the radar a little bit in some different fantasy drafts just because, like I said, we just forget about guys sometimes. So I really like him on this list. I too would probably have him right up there on the cusp of the top 15. Just kind of a fringe player, but certainly a great late round draft pick for sure. Okay, so coming up next, this is kind of an interesting one, and I think that it might surprise some people here as well. But we have Chris Paul of the Suns. So why do you think Paul is not in our top 15, James?
I think he's, Father Time is undefeated. And when you look at the guys that are in his draft class, he's taken a lot of wear and tear. He plays attacking the basket. He's been knocked down. He's a little guy who likes to get in and around that free throw line. He's very proficient on that elbow jumper, but that comes with a lot of contact over time. He's played a lot of playoff minutes, albeit they weren't successful there with the Clippers, but he logged a ton of minutes in his time in LA. So as a point guard, when you're asked to do everything, which he was in his first 6 seasons, that's, some people's tires, you can go 50, 60,000 miles depending on how you drive them. He's ran it rough. So he really hit a wall in that Dallas playoff series. And I think part of that was because he was just completely exposed when they played New Orleans in the playoffs. And it's to a point now where, you have to respect his mid-range game, but you're seeing guys that are going to just let him shoot that open three. They're going to focus on Booker. They're going to focus on Ayton. He's shooting 32% last season from three. He's really going to need to keep that at that 32% in order for him to maintain. He's just under 15 points a game last season. So He's always going to be a good assist guy. So if you're in a multiplayer league, there's value there. He's great, got great hands. He plays with his feet. So, I think the steals, I think that'll be pretty consistent. He was just under 2 last year. He'll probably still be like 1.5, something like that. He doesn't turn the ball over. I just see a scenario where they're going to slowly kind of move the offense away from him, especially with DeAndre Ayton stating that he wants to be a little bit more involved in the offense this year. So, it's hard to begrudge what will go down as arguably probably the top 5 point guard of all time. It's sad when you start to see people decline like this. Dwayne Wade retired early before he ever got to this level. He had that really bad year in Chicago, and he's just like, I don't want to go out that route. And we kind of see Carmelo grasping at straws a little bit, but he understands his role. Chris is still the primary point guard and an option, and you're comparing him against the likes of LeBron James, and it's unfair because this is a realistic 20-year in the league body and realistic stat line for a guy who is asking to draw, a double team his entire career, put a lot of miles on it, and so this is the result. So I don't fault him. He's still going to be a solid guy. I like him right here, right on the cusp, but he's definitely not a top 15 player anymore.
No, I agree. He's not a top 15 player, not even a top 15 point guard at this point. So it is kind of hard to watch some of these guys deteriorate, in front of you. We're talking about Father Time being undefeated. Well, if Father Time and Mother Nature had a love child, it's probably LeBron. So you can't really look at him and make the comparison and say, well, LeBron can do it at his age. Everybody else can't. LeBron's just a freak of nature. So Paul, his scoring is going to go down. We had a note here for the show. His scoring's dropped off for the last 5 seasons. It may again. I have him on projections right around 14, 15 points a game. He is always going to be a great source of assists, and it helps when you can just pitch the ball out to Devin Booker. Certainly that helps. But he's probably going to be around 10, 11 assists. Steals have always been elite. They're probably going to move from elite to very good. 1.5, 1.6 steals, somewhere around there. He'll get you a block. He's going to turn over the ball just a couple of times a game, even as much as he handles it, which is crazy. So even at his age, that's not going to become a problem. But the elite games that you have from Paul are just going to be fewer and further between now. And that's really going to keep him out of that top 15. So I didn't have him in my top 15. I know that when we did the consensus, he was just right outside. But yeah, I think that Paul is reaching that point now where you're starting to kind of wonder, where is this career going to go? So coming up next, we have one more honorable mention, and this is a player who is still really young and certainly a great pick in a dynasty basketball setting, and that's De'Aaron Fox of the Kings. So James, give me some thoughts on Fox.
He's always been an enigma to me. If he's available in that 5th, 6th round, I might consider, depending on if I've already got my starting point guard and I'm confident. The problem is he'll have a 6-7 game stretch where he's the best point guard in the league, and then he'll show flashes, and everybody will be like, "This is it. He's finally turning the corner," and then it'll really, really retract. And I think Sacramento's going to be exciting to watch this season. Just from a firepower standpoint, I like some of the additions that they brought in. Kevin Huerter's going to be he's just a guy that I enjoy watching do little to nothing. If they have those charts, the little clips that they put into their shorts, you can track the mileage. And I remember about 6 or 7 years ago, Nick Batum ended up logging about 4 miles per game running. I'm pretty sure Kevin Huerter's doing a half a mile a game, and that's as a starter. I mean, the guy just barely moves. But what he does is he frees up. He brings the defense out, which allows De'Aaron to do what he does best, which is really attacking the lane. He has to be a north-south guy. He's shooting 30% from 3. I'd like to see him get his 3-point percentage up a little bit more. I don't know. I feel like at this point in his career, he is what he is. He's going to give you solid production across the board, but he's definitely not a top 15 guy. If you're able to get him in a trade when he's hot, or if somebody dumps him for whatever reason, and when he's not, I mean, he's definitely worth picking up a flyer on. I definitely wouldn't want to be sitting on him as my priority point guard as we get into the playoffs, just because he's too inconsistent for me. So I don't have it in my top 15.
Yeah, neither did I. And my bigger concern with Fox is really Keegan Murray. So one of the things that I've been really lucky enough to have is a good number of resources, be it in high school or college, just knowing a lot of different coaches who have actually coached a lot of NBA prospects, and also, some current Division I college coaches. So guys that I've talked to, coaches who I know, they unbelievable. It was across the board. They said Keegan Murray is going to be the single best player from this draft. So now, is that going to come to fruition? I don't know, but those are people who I really trust. So I think that Murray's emergence, that is seemingly inevitable within that offense, is going to hurt some of the production we normally see from De'Aaron Fox. So I love Sabonis. I think Murray's a good player. I think Davion Mitchell's a good player. I think they have a lot of youth there, and a lot of things going for him. I just don't look at Fox as anybody who's going to do much more than really score the basketball. So he's going to be one of the better scoring point guards, probably somewhere in the 24 point per game range. Assists are going to be there, 6 or 7. You're going to get a handful of rebounds. You're going to get a handful of turnovers. Nothing too spectacular either way. I would love to see his field goal percentage be better. It's probably going to be sub 50 again. And then free throw percentage as well. He's not an elite free throw shooter at all. So he's somewhere around 75%. So there are some things that Fox has that are not necessarily going his way. So it keeps him out of the top 15. Now, granted, in any given week, he can be point guard number 1 because he does have those incredible hot streaks. But I just wouldn't want to have somebody like that as my primary point guard, because those hot streaks do come with some cold streaks as well. So not really a guy who would make my list. So with that, and I actually, James, I think we made it, about 6 minutes before you offended somebody's family. So I think Kevin Huerter's family, if they're listening to the show, you probably already have your first apology that's ready to go. It's in your pocket. So just in case somebody calls in, you owe that to them.
The guy doesn't run. At some point,
so I say that and you just double down. I say that and you just double down.
Yep. Dead-eyed Dick running less than a mile a game. I'm telling you, it's unreal.
Well, let's talk about somebody who does run a little bit more. Okay, we're talking about what's the pride of Wichita State here, right? So Fred VanVleet of the Raptors, he comes in at number 15. What do you like about Fred?
I like the thing about Fred VanVleet is, if he is on another roster, he's kind of Jalen Brunson to me. Just doesn't move the needle. He fits this Toronto roster really, really, really well. He sets a tone. He's built a really, really good relationship with Pascal Siakam and Scotty Barnes, and I think Scotty Barnes is going to be good for a long time. So much so that I actually think he's going to make the talk of Pascal Siakam, who's been in trade rumors for 2-3 seasons now. You might see them kind of get a little bit closer to pulling the trigger on something like that. But what I like about Fred is he literally is the head of that beast. And Toronto is perpetually in that top 5 in the East. I think they're going to be that way this year. He's 28 years old. He was an all-star last season. The only thing that concerns me a little bit is from a shooting percentage standpoint. The guy shoots 38% from 3. His total field goal percentage is 40%. So he doesn't finish around the basket as well as I'd like. I think part of that is they play with a really, really big lineup. So he kind of stays that mid-range game, and that's not his specialty. He's also a north-south guy. So they're bringing back almost an identical roster from last season. And like I said, I think that camaraderie and that team atmosphere that they're building up in Toronto is going to be something that keeps his number statistic from last season. So read that 20 points, 4.4 rebounds, 6.7 assists. So he can pepper the stat sheet. So I see him being pretty consistent with last year, and that's a pretty productive player for a top 15.
Yeah, and I think that you touched upon that a little bit. One of the things I really do like about Van Vliet is his consistency. So as opposed to somebody like Fox, who might get you 2 or 3 monster games in a given 2 or 3 week period, Van Vliet's going to be pretty consistent all across the board. And it's nice just to have players like that in your lineup who you can just pencil in for what seem to be almost guaranteed points. You also touched upon the one thing that really does push him down the chart, and that's his field goal percentage. It's probably going to be somewhere around 40%, which is well below average. Now, certainly he does, he shoots a lot of threes, but you hit upon the fact that he doesn't finish at the rim as well as some others. He is going to be obviously a good source of points and threes. I mean, he's probably going to be somebody who gets you 3 or 4 threes every game. Assist numbers are not going to be elite like they would be with Chris Paul or Tyrese Halliburton or Trae Young or some of these others who we may talk about later on in the program, #foreshadow. But I see him as a player who you could have as kind of your second point guard on your roster and somebody who you can really lean on. So if you go heavy in some other areas and you end up with Van Vliet even as your top point guard, you're not thrilled with it, but it's not going to kill your fantasy team either. So I do like him at 15. I think that he's one of the better choices, certainly within the draft. I like him. I like him a lot. I love that consistency for sure. And I do think that he's a great complement to Scotty Barnes, who I 100% agree with you is going to be just an absolute stud in this league. He was great as a rookie. Some people I don't think he gets the respect that he would if he played in New York or Los Angeles, and being up in Toronto, he probably just doesn't have the respect that he really deserves. But Barnes is a heck of a good player, and Van Vliet is as well.
I'll tell you, the one last thing on Van Vliet is, depending on what type of league you're in, so, oftentimes these leagues are casual, so you'll see a lot of guys with name value that go before. So from a statistical standpoint and a fantasy standpoint, I just really don't think Chris Paul's going to be able to touch anything Fred's going to be able to do. But from a name value, a lot of people will pick based on what a guy's done versus what he's going to be doing in the following season. So, depending on how you play your cards right and if you understand the guys you have in your league, Van Vliet is one of those guys that you may be able to pick up in that 5th, 6th round that gets dumped because, like you said, Toronto doesn't get a ton of press. For being a perpetual top 5 in the East for the last 5-6 seasons. They won a championship less than 5 years ago. They just really don't get the same oomph as, Golden State or Minnesota right now. I mean, they're kind of forgotten about. So you got to play your cards right, because you don't want to let him, if you're on the turn, for instance, in your draft, you got to know who you're in there with, but you may be able to snag him in later rounds if somebody goes based on name value. So he could end up being a sleeper in some drafts as well.
Yeah, he certainly could. So let's talk about a player who was a sleeper last year and really hit. There are some questions about him just based on a recent transaction that we've touched upon a little bit. But at 14, we have Darius Garland. And Darius Garland was fantastic last year, but certainly the addition of Donovan Mitchell clouds his future a little bit. So what are your thoughts on Darius Garland, James?
So on the surface, I look at this Mitchell acquisition and I think this is exactly what he needed, because many times last season, the way that roster was comprised, Karis LeVert has never been a guy who can create his own shot. He's more of a basketball card guy than he is an on-court guy. Evan Mobley had a great year. I'm not on the Evan Mobley hype train as much as everybody else. I'm not going to go out there and proclaim he's Tim Duncan 2.0 just yet. But I do like what I see from him. But again, from an offensive perspective, that's not what I want as my number 2. Same thing with Jared Allen. So there were times when they would pressure Garland, and he was if you look at his turnover percentage, so he had 3.6 turnovers. I think a lot of that was just forced errors, given the fact that he didn't have a lot of options to bail him out. So Mitchell absolutely right out of the gate alleviates a lot of that. And Garland is a willing passer, 8.6 assists last year, and that really was with, in my opinion, looking at that roster, a lack of offensive options. Where I see the dip is going to come inevitably is going to be from field goal attempts, because you're talking Donovan Mitchell, who was top 10 in the league in field goal attempts last season, albeit a different situation. But he's going to be getting his 18 to 20 shots a night. And how much do you want to develop Evan Mobley's offensive game? So where I see, 21 points, maybe not, maybe get him closer to that 19 points. I think there's an opportunity for his assist to, be closer to that 10. I think defensively he's great. He's going to be guarding the other team's best wing. So whether that's the point guard or the shooting guard, because that's not Mitchell's strong point. For both of them, they can afford to be a little more risky this year on the steal side, just because they know they've got great help in the backcourt. So I like it. I'm not sure that he has an all-star appearance in his future this season. I think the Cavaliers will be better in real life, but from a fantasy perspective, it might be a slight step back from last year where he was just absolutely fantastic.
Well, and I think that most of our listeners, if you go out to eBay right now, you can probably see that James has like 50 different Karis LeVert rookie cards maybe on sale right now. You're really plugging the Karis LeVert rookie card today. So
I like the guy, but the overhype train when he left Brooklyn was just, it was unreal. And I mean, he's a solid guy, but he just doesn't have the size. And I think that he thinks he's better than he is. And that just doesn't translate when you don't have help. So
no, and I wish that there was a stat out there that you could count in fantasy for ego, like how good you think you are. That would be fantastic. So Kyrie would be the 1.01, but we'll get to him as we move forward here for sure. I like Garland as well. I think that there are some questions about exactly what he's going to be able to produce. It's interesting. I think that two of the biggest storylines in fantasy basketball are the pairing of Darius Garland and Donovan Mitchell in Cleveland, and also DeJounte Murray and Trae Young in Atlanta. So how those guys coexist and what those statistics look like are going to be fascinating from a fantasy basketball standpoint. I think that the stat to look at with Garland is going to be that field goal percentage. Right now, it's right about average, somewhere around 45, 46, 47%. Does the addition of Mitchell make that better because he gets some more open shots? I don't know. And I think that's a big question. If that can get up towards, closer to 50, 49, 50, it doesn't sound like a lot, but over the course of an 82-game season, that's pretty significant. You're also talking about a guy who's going to shoot 90% from the free throw line. He's going to get you a handful of threes. The counting stats are going to come from his points and his assists. The rest of it, you're going to get a handful of rebounds and steals. You're going to get a block every 2 weeks. You're not going to get a lot outside of scoring and threes and assists. So where does that assist number come in at? I think that's the other thing with Garland. So you were saying maybe close to 10. I have him close to 8. And it doesn't sound like a lot, but it's significant when you're talking about these counting stats for fantasy basketball. So Garland is one of those players who, my guess is he's going to be overdrafted in a lot of different leagues. So, you talked about the casual fantasy basketball player. I think they're going to look at him. They're going to look at his stats from last year. People who are not necessarily in the know, people who don't do their homework, people who don't listen to hint podcasts, they may just take him just kind of based on what his production was last year. And I think it's going to be very, very difficult for him to really repeat what he did last season. And that's not saying he's not a fantastic player. He's a super, super player for sure. But there are a lot more mouths to feed in Cleveland. And this is really their best team that they've been able to put together post LeBron. So it's I think it's going to be a fun team to watch. And I think that storyline is going to be really fascinating to see how it kind of plays out during the year.
I agree. Let's move on to number 13, which is going to be Cade Cunningham of the Detroit Pistons. Come off a fantastic rookie season last season. Surprisingly, Detroit chooses to go with a guard in the backcourt. It looks like they're shooting for playoffs in year 2 of Cade's career. I think that I'm excited to see where Detroit goes because they're they're a team that could easily say, look, we're going to race to the bottom one more season, but I just don't know if they have that in their DNA moving forward. So out of the gate, what are you looking at with Cade?
Well, I see a player here who he's a bit of an enigma to me, because he came in, there was obviously a lot of hype being the number one pick in the draft. He performed fairly well last year. The field goal percentage was borderline awful. It needs to be better. You're looking at a guy who's shooting, sub 45. You're looking at maybe even 42, 43% from the field, which, again, it doesn't seem like a lot, but it's significant for sure in fantasy and in reality. So I see a player here who I think he has an opportunity to be a little bit better than he was just because of the addition of Jaden Ivey. So Ivey's a dog. I mean, he is a dog. He is an alpha when it comes to playing the game. And I think that's going to really help Cade, because Cade is not that way. He's more of a quiet soul. He's one of those guys who isn't going to be super boisterous, isn't going to be overly emotional. I think he's going to be... I think that Cade Cunningham, I'll put it this way, he's best as a Robin instead of a Batman. Now, is Ivy good enough to be a Batman? That remains to be seen, but I do think that Cunningham isn't going to have to be the dude every single night next season. So how that translates to fantasy, we'll see. But I think that the field goal percentage is certainly a concern. Free throw percentage is going to be fine. Can he improve upon his scoring output? So it's certainly got better throughout the year as he got more comfortable in the league. Can he get over that 20-point threshold? Right now, I have him just a smidge under. Rebounds are going to be there. Assists are going to be there. Everything else is going to be, okay. I think that turnovers are still a little bit of an issue, but we'll see what happens again with Ivy there as well. So, much like, other players we've talked about, whether it's Garland or others, does having another player who is highly regarded, who plays a guard position, will they be able to get you 2 or 3 more open shots a game? And if so, I think that Cunningham can really produce. So it's funny, like we as fantasy managers, we're very impatient. And I think that some people just expected Cunningham to come out of the gates last year and just set the world on fire. And that was really never going to be his game. He's still super, super young. And Detroit is not exactly, the place where you're going to go and just put up some amazingly crazy stats. They just didn't have players around him. So a lot of defenses could really key on him, even as a rookie. So I think that there's a nice ceiling for him. I don't think that it is, elite by any stretch of the imagination, but I think Cunningham can be a good player. I think that he can be, a top 12, top 13, 14 fantasy point guard next season. But he's one that has some upside as well. So, I like him a lot better than, many of the players we've already talked about. I think that his situation is set, and I think that we're going to see a little bit of growth from him this year. So I look at him as a safe pick. I think that there's a pretty high floor with him. I just don't see, his game maybe evolving to that elite status, but you know what? It's okay. You don't have to have 15 elite guys on a fantasy roster. You need to have some guys who are consistent. Other thoughts on Cunningham, James?
Well, I think you and I definitely differ when it comes to kind of the dog aspect. I think Cade's got a lot of energy. I think that he wants to kind of bring some respect back to Detroit. The difference between him and Jaden Ivey is actually pretty stark. Ivey's not really a set up the offense type point guard. He's more of an undersized shooting guard. So he's kind of that in between. Defensively, I think Ivey on the roster allows, Detroit to put Ivey on the other team's best guard position because that isn't one of Cade's strengths at this point. So the steals that he got last year, 1.2, a lot of that is just kind of he's a smart player. So who he reminds me of Andre Miller when Andre Miller came in the league. He understands how to use his body. It's 6'6". I mean, he's got good size at 220 pounds. So he knows how to kind of take advantage of the mismatch. He's got a good back to the basket game. I think he's got to look to evolve on that moving forward, especially with Ivy. So in scenarios where you got, him and Ivey in the backcourt. I think if there is a mismatch and he gets a smaller guard on him, I think he's going to kind of go that barbecue chicken route. So from a scoring perspective, 17.4 last year, and he was their primary offensive option, to be honest with you, and he's a rookie, new in the league. So I thought that was pretty encouraging. Yes, the field goal percentage, I think that a lot of that has to do with, getting acclimated with bigger bodies and a faster game pace. So I think in time that'll come. I bet he seems very heady to me in the times that I've watched him. And like I said, the way that he plays the game and approaches those mismatches and kind of plays with his head, he reminds me of Andre Miller. And what I like is in that draft as well, because Ivey's going to get all the pub for Detroit, but I think Jalen Duren is going to end up being their starter at the end of the season. The guy is just a freak athletically. I think he's got to fit that mold. I'm still holding stock in Marvin Bagley. I don't know when I'm going to cash in. It's kind of like GameStop at this point. I guess I'm just waiting for it to hit 6 cents, then I'll cash out. But I think this could be an opportunity for Bagley to be a serviceable player. There's a lot of grumblings about Saddiq Bey having a breakout season. So there's some momentum with Detroit. I think they're still going to be fighting for that play-in game. But I think that's a step in the direction of what could be a pretty good process moving forward for Detroit. And I think it really starts with Cade.
Well, Bagley's certainly a guy who would be considered a buy low. It's almost a get free at this point with Bagley. So if you do have that belief, he's one of those guys that you can pick up in the last round of your draft and just kind of take a flyer on. Certainly been a disappointing start to his career. There's no question about it. And, you talk about Andre Miller. So, Andre Miller played with, one of the Hall of Fame greats in Keith Van Horn. Way, way back when in the Utah, do you remember that? Utah played for the national championship. Andre Miller, Keith Van Horn, and head coach, God rest his soul, Rick Majerus.
Let me tell you something. I mean, when he came out of college, no one knew that Tim Duncan would go on to be the greatest power forward of all time. But when they came out of college, there wasn't any talk about Tim Duncan at that time. I mean, he was a consensus number 1 overall pick because of his potential. But Keith Van Horn was that guy who was like right out of the gate. He was NBA body ready, and that's just a sad story of injuries and there's a million of them. But I would have liked to have seen, a good 15-year run with Keith Van Horn in the league. I loved his game. He was kind of Dirk-esque.
Dirk-esque.
Dirk-esque. He was very heady.
That is a new word that we're going to use. Dirk-esque. For sure.
Yeah, that Utah team was good.
Yeah. So coming up on episode number 2 of the Fantasy Basketball Podcast, it'll be all about Keith Van Horn. We'll talk nothing but KVH. Actually,
I absolutely have his rookie card still.
Hey, so do I. So, yeah, I did not think we would talk about Keith Van Horn and Rick Majerus today, but here we are. All right, let's get into our top 12. So, in a 12-team league, these are the guys who you'd have as your PG1s. And the first one we're going to talk about is a guy who had an amazing breakout season last year and then got moved. Okay, so that's DeJounte Murray of the Atlanta Hawks. So, certainly a top 12 guy, in terms of point guard. Last year he was a top 7-8 guy overall, so just an amazing season for him. But there are questions really that are surrounding him now, because moving from San Antonio to Atlanta, we just don't know what to expect, especially playing right next to Trae Young. So what is this going to look like for DeJounte next year? This is a player who has some unbelievable talent. I can tell you, I'm a basketball coach in the state of Washington, so I was able to see DeJounte Murray in person. This guy is absolutely dynamic, and it does not shock me that he hit big in the NBA. Just from a very young age, this kid was the real deal. There's no question about it. So what is this going to look like in Atlanta, playing next to Young and with that team? Certainly in San Antonio, he was able to get whatever he wanted, within that system, and he was the primary basket getter. And in Atlanta, he's just not going to be that. So, his field goal percentage should be about the same. He's a decent free throw shooter as well. It's going to be scoring, rebounds, and assists with him. And there are just questions about what he can actually produce. How many shots is he really going to get? Murray has the talent to be one of the top 10 or 12 players in fantasy, but it's just a very different situation. And again, we're talking about players who are likely going to be overdrafted, and I think Murray's going to be one of those players too. So for those casual guys and gals who get into a fantasy league and then just look at last year's statistics and just go chalk, they're likely going to take him in, round 2, and then likely they're going to be disappointed because they could have got some value out of somebody else, in his stead. So I like Murray obviously as a player. I just wonder, is he going to be able to score more than 18, 19, 20 points a game? So, he's going to get you 6 rebounds and 6 assists, and he's going to be a solid source of points, but I just don't know what it's going to look like, from a scoring, statistical, counting numbers perspective, especially because he just doesn't shoot a ton of threes. So I think this is one of those trades that you look at and you think, wow, this is really good in reality, and it may not be quite as good in fantasy. Do you agree?
To an extent, but this is one of those things where I think you and I differ, and I think that's going to I think the people who listen to this show are going to find the value in the fact that we aren't necessarily lockstep in how we approach this. So in this scenario specifically, I actually had DeJounte as my 10th ranked. So he's fallen in at 12. I had him 2 spots above Trae Young, who I just think from this perspective, what DeJounte can do, he's definitely more malleable. So for those who you weren't familiar, you can plug him like Play-Doh. And yes, from an offensive standpoint, he had the lion's share of possessions for San Antonio, but he distributed at 9.2, so he was top 10 in the league in assists on a team that really didn't have a ton of options. But defensively, he was always, they traded Derek White to Boston, and then he stepped in and took on the role as guarding the team's best offensive player in the backcourt. So, 2 steals a game. I definitely think he's going to be top 5 steals this year. Playing off, I think he's going to be their primary defender in Atlanta because that's just not Trae's bag. So I think from a defensive standpoint, Trae's numbers will back off, so he'll get hit there. I think DeJounte could walk into 18 to 20 points in that style of offense in the Eastern Conference that isn't getting your brains bashed in 41 games out of the season. I think he's going to need to understand that, and it's kind of a blessing and a curse. Some of those field goal attempts will definitely be going to John Collins. You got a $23 million investment in him, so they're going to have some offensive sets that just run differently. But I don't actually think that's a negative for Murray because I think we could see his assists actually go up. So I don't see him taking nearly as big of a bump as Trae will this season just because Trae's not going to have the defensive opportunities to give you any kind of defensive stats. DeJounte might give him a little bit easier looks. He's going to have to hit those. But I think that you're going to see a pretty consistent stat line for DeJounte. Maybe not top 10 value like he was towards the end of last season, but I still think he'll be a top 15, top 20. So if you can get him 12 on the point guard rankings, I think that's a steal.
It very well could be. Like I said, the talent with him is really unquestioned. Now, let's go back to the well here, the Cleveland well, which is it's crazy. You think about teams historically who have not been very good. And I think a lot of people out there, when we talk about demographics and those who listen to us, they think of the Cavs with LeBron. We likely think of the Cavs with Ron Harper and Mark Price and Brad Daugherty and Craig Elo and players like that. And that was really their first.
Forget Sean Kemp.
Yeah, there was the year of the Kemp.
Chubby
Yes, for
Sean
sure.
Kemp.
Yes, the fat Sean Kemp years. Yes, for sure. But Cleveland hasn't always been a juggernaut, for sure. And they're going all in. There's no question about it. So the next guy on our list is obviously going to be Donovan Mitchell. The trade that they made is legitimately huge. Okay? So they sent Lauri Markkanen, who has been a very serviceable player, both in fantasy and reality over the last few years. Certainly there are some limitations to his game. We'll get to the forwards at some point here. Their top pick this year, Ochai Agbaji, who I think is going to be a good piece for that Utah team. It's going to take him a little bit of time, but this is an NBA-ready type of player. Colin Sexton, who we already talked about, and he has obviously great upside. 3 first-round picks, 2025, 27, and 29, and then 2 pick swaps. So basically, Utah has the draft picks from Cleveland from 2025 through 2029. And that is a monster deal and a ton to give up for a single player. However, we've seen Mitchell go nuclear before, and he is one of the single best talents in the league. Now, I think there are some questions, obviously, and we've talked a little bit about him. How does he fit in with Garland? How does he fit in with Mobley? How does he fit in with Jared Allen? All these different things. There are mouths to feed, certainly, in Cleveland. You'd like to see the field goal percentage be up a little bit, but he's going to score the ball. Okay, so the challenge with Mitchell is going to be the other stats. So whether it's blocks, turnovers are going to be kind of below average. Rebounds are going to be below average as well. I mean, he's probably somebody who's looking at sub 4 rebounds. Assist numbers are going to be okay, probably in the 5 range, but certainly not something that, you know, somebody like James Harden or others is going to give you. So if you have a multiplier, it is something to take into consideration for sure. You know he's going to score points, though, and he's going to be a great guard for sure for Cleveland, and I think for fantasy teams too. So if you go forward heavy, center heavy, early in drafts, and you can get Donovan Mitchell on the turn, you're probably doing just fine. What are your thoughts on Mitchell moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see him really bumping. The way that his game translates, he's very much like CJ McCollum to me. He can shoot the ball and he can score, and he'll be able to score on any team, this one included. He's not fighting for shots. Darius Garland is a willing passer. Like I said, I have a feeling he's going to be top 5 in assists this season. So Donovan Mitchell will still get his shots now. He was averaging like top 10 in the league. It was like just under 21 shots a game last year. So I don't know that he's going to be getting that kind of look, especially if they're trying to develop Evan Mobley. But, I think he's going to walk into 24, 25 points. So, and he's never been a guy to really fight for rebounds or assists. So stat-wise, I think you're going to see a pretty consistent line. Defensively, again, and I kind of made this point with Garland, when you got Mobley and you have Jared Allen in the back, I'd like to see them take a few more chances beyond the arc as far as, defensive intensities. He's giving you 1.5 steals per game. If you're in a multiplayer league, that's great. If he was to increase that, the way that he plays, the way that his body is, it's not going to be much more than 1.7. So I don't see a huge bump coming from there. It's going to be curious to see outside of the fantasy standpoint, how he plays with an athletic guard who can create his own shot. Because in his prime, Mike Conley could do that. But in the last few years that he's been playing with Mitchell, he's been kind of settle for threes and a distributor. So it's just going to be a different type of point guard. I think he's going to like it in some ways, and I think it's going to kind of be a shock to him in some ways. So his game might take a little bit of time to kind of get up and running. So maybe he's not hot out of the gate. But once he hits his stride, about 10, 15 games in the season, I think he's going to be pretty solid.
All right, so that's going to bring us to the top 10. And there's certainly some premier players here. This is obviously one of the premier positions in fantasy as well. I'm going to give you the floor for the next one because this is what I would say is your bona fide man crush for this next season. And, we talked about Utah having a zillion draft picks. The other team that has a zillion draft picks is Oklahoma City. But they also have a star in the making as well, and that's Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. So, James, take it away.
Yeah, he's just one of my favorites. He plays. He's a both side of the ball type guy, and he is also one of those guys who he does the things that don't show up on the score sheet. So from a fantasy perspective, that can suck in some ways. But when he's on, I mean, he's a double a guy, and he's consistent across the board. My concern is, I don't know what Oklahoma City's plan is going to be this year. I don't know where Indiana's going to go this year. I don't know what Detroit's going to do this year. I don't know what Orlando's going to do this year, because this whole race to the bottom, the philosophy has changed in the fact that the draft odds are 16%. That's about as good as you're going to get, right?
Well, and it's different now because, I mean, in the Knicks day, you could just refrigerate an envelope and stick it in a bowl, or as you would call it, an orb, and then just pull it out of there. So it's different. It's totally different now. You bring up a good point.
Well, my question has been this, and this is just for me being a fan of him personally, is when you're developing a squad and all they know for 2, 3, 4 seasons is to lose, right? If you look at how that translated with Philly, it took a while for them to kind of understand a winning culture. You're paying a lot of money to SGA to sit back and say, we're going to go through another year of tanking. Now, I think he wants to win at some point, ultimately. And I don't think Victor Wembanyama is going to take Oklahoma City and put them in the Western Conference in one season, especially the way that roster is made up. You can't have 4 guys at 7-1, and expect to get to the Western Conference Finals. That's just, the game just doesn't translate. So I'd like to see them actually try to make some moves this season with those draft picks to say, look, we're beginning the process, and then the cherry on top is going to be Chet Holmgren when he comes back from his injury next season. And if SGA is in a position where, hey, look, we're not going to rest you with quote-unquote load management because we're trying to make sure we're in the bottom 5 in the West, we're going to kind of give you the reins. You're going to have Josh Giddey, who is an absolute stud, to take some of the ball handling responsibilities to open up some attack lanes for you because he's a north-south guy as well. So when I look at his stats last year, 24.5, 5 rebounds, 5.9 assists, 1.3 steals. I see an opportunity for him to, from a rebound and an assist standpoint, I see an opportunity for those to kind of bump up over 6, 6.5 on both of them. I'd like to see him in a situation where he's playing 58 games minimum. And it's so comical to me that I'm actually got my fingers crossed that players are going to give us close to 60 games. It's just laughable. But if he does, he's about as consistent as it gets. And he plays on both sides of the ball. And I just personally like him. So if Shea's there and it's a toss-up between him and a Kyrie and I don't know what I'm going to get, I'm going to take Shea. If it's a toss-up between him and a Cade, I'm going to take Cade. If it's a toss-up between him and a Trae Young, I'm going to take Shea. So that's just a little bit of personal bias on my end. But, a lot of it's going to be whatever Oklahoma City's philosophy is for the season.
Well, I can't imagine Oklahoma City is going to be in a position where they want to start moving those draft picks to get other pieces to be competitive this year. It just seems counterproductive to what they're trying to do. Now, had Holmgren stayed healthy through the preseason, maybe that's a little bit different if they started out hot. But with him out for the entire campaign, I just don't see them making moves to add players that are going to make them better. So, and you bring up a great point with culture. I mean, the Rockets have not been able to kind of get out of that. They tanked it as well, just like the Sixers. And, we trusted the process for a long time, and it took a long time to get there. And really, a couple of things really worked in Philly's way to even kind of put them into the mix. So it's tough. It's certainly a tough business. I just don't see Oklahoma City doing much else with the roster. And I think that makes Shea an extraordinarily safe player to draft. One of the things that you look for just from a strategy perspective in any fantasy sport, whether it's football, baseball, basketball, is value. So you can get value with Shea here because, like you said, there are so many of these bigger names that are going to go ahead of him, but the production that he's likely going to have, even on a team that's not very good. I mean, there isn't a fantasy stat out there that says team wins, at least not in most leagues. So he's a player who you can get, and I think he's going to be a player who is likely underdrafted as opposed to overdrafted. So speaking of players who are, well, interesting, let's talk a little bit about Kyrie Irving. Okay, so Irving is one of those players who is certainly one of the best players in the league in terms of his level of ability and skill. It's off the charts. I mean, he is quite possibly the single best ball handler in the history of the league. He can get to the rim just with very little effort. He makes things look so much easier than they actually are. The challenge with Kyrie is obvious. How many games is he going to play? Okay, so you talked about us wanting to get to a point where we could get to 58, 59, 60 games from people. I have no idea what you're going to get from Kyrie. He could get hurt, which happens quite often, or he could just all of a sudden say, hey, I want to take a sabbatical in Alaska for the next couple of months, and I don't really feel like playing. I just want to go burn some incense somewhere. So I don't know what I'm going to get from him. He's likely going to be a player who is just not on my roster. I'm going to let somebody else take the plunge. I'm just not going to be somebody who, goes after Kyrie and the name value. I'm just not interested in it. You're going to get elite scoring. You're going to get, 3-pointers made and great free throw percentage and all these different things. But I just don't want to have guys on my team who I can't count on. So I would be very reluctant to take Kyrie myself. He's likely going to be one of those guys who's just on somebody else's team.
Yeah, I mean, the sad part is, and this is so mind-numbingly frustrating when it comes to him, because I struggle, and it's not for things like, his stance on, popping a cold one. Nice. It's not for things like, his stance last year as far as the vaccination. It's none of that stuff. And I don't even mind his philosophical takes and his war with the media or any of that nonsense. None of that matters. The sad part to me is when the guy's on the floor, I mean, this is a team that was loaded, shot 47% from the field, ridiculous. 42% from three, ridiculous. 92% from the free throw line, ridiculous. The guy, and this is a guy who his degree of difficulty on his finishing at the basket it's just unreal. The guy's got a lay-in package that is unrivaled in the league right now. And a bulk of this came with Harden and Durant on the floor. He's still putting up almost 30 points a game. He's still giving you 4.4 rebounds as an undersized guard. Still giving you 5.8 assists. So from a stat perspective, if he's playing, he's top 15 value. And that's just across the board, especially in 9-cat leagues where your percentages come into play. The problem is you just don't know. He's played 103 games the last 3 seasons. Now, there's been different reasons for that. Part of his injury. Part of it was the whole COVID vaccines and mandates. He's not going to run into that this year, except when he goes to Toronto. Everybody's going to have that issue. But this is where I stand. This is one of those 50-50. If you make this move, it's either going to be really, really good for you to blow up. And if it's good, I mean, we're talking cash cow. I think Kyrie's going to have an FU season this year. I think he's going to have his mind, and I think Kevin Durant's the same way. I think they both have this slighted chip on their shoulder, like they need to remind the league of just how good they are. Even though their stats, no one ever argues their stat line. It's all the other stuff. But they never listen to the other stuff. They just think it's an indictment on how they play as basketball players, right? And that's never the argument. It's the off-the-court stuff. But they get that conflated. And I think both of them are going to go absolutely gangbusters. So depending on where I'm at in the draft, right? If I'm third round and it's mid-third round, I'm on the turn, I'm going to take Kyrie in that first pick before the turn. And I'm going to bank on him just absolutely going nuts this year and just tearing the league apart. And if that's the case and it pays out, I'm looking at a top 15 fantasy player. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. So that's a risk. I'm not saying take it, but at number 9 right now, I have a feeling that he'll end up being top 3 point guards in the league at the end of the season.
He certainly could be, but he also could be. One of my favorite movies in the world is Pulp Fiction, and you think about one of those final scenes where Jules says, I might just walk the earth like Kane from Kung Fu. I really think that there might be a point where Kyrie just says, I'm going to do that. And he just walks out. This is where you and I do differ a little bit in team building. And I think that you are a little bit more of a risk taker than I am. I want guys who I can count on. And I've just never been able to count on Kyrie Irving. So let's go ahead and move on to number 8 as we get into our top 8 here. This might surprise some people as low as he is, but I think there are some legitimate questions about Steph Curry of the Golden State Warriors. So nobody's going to argue just how great he is. When you talk about shooters in this league, historically, you would be hard-pressed to find anybody who could shoot the basketball better than Steph Curry. He has just been an unbelievable player for many, many years now. the question that I have about Steph, I think, is going to be obvious. Okay, you know what you're going to get statistically when he plays in terms of free throw percentage. He's going to be elite when it comes to made threes. He's going to be 4 or 5 a game. He's going to be 25 plus points per game. He's going to get you rebounds. He's going to get you assists. He's going to get you all that. My question is, how much is he really going to play? Because Golden State is again loaded, and we've talked about this off the air a few times. The Warriors have a team that is really unique because they are stacked, locked, and loaded to be competitive this year. But they're also full of young players who are really, really good. And this is going to be one of those seasons where they're going to find ways to get Wiseman time, Moses Moody time, Jonathan Kuminga time. They're going to find ways to get those young players on the court, especially if they start out hot. So is Curry going to be one of those guys? And I've hated this term for years and years and years, but load management, it's a real thing. And I think that with Curry, there is that concern with load management in him. You know, how many games is he actually going to play? And even in those games, how many minutes is he realistically going to get? This is not a 19-year-old kid anymore. You know, he's a grown man, and they want to extend his career and extend this championship window as long as they possibly can. So is he going to play 34, 35, 36 minutes a night? I don't think he is. I think he's going to be a player who's probably closer to 30. And while you can say, hey, he's the most elite shooter in the history of mankind, when you play 30 minutes a game instead of 37, 38, it makes a difference in terms of your fantasy stats and your output. So he's a guy who can obviously go off at any given time. He's a great player to have on your fantasy squad, but I don't have him in the top 8 either in my own personal rankings. So do you agree with that assessment in terms of Curry and Golden State?
Yeah, so I mean, the things to keep in mind with Steph Curry is from a statistical and fantasy standpoint, he can do a lot of damage in a short amount of time. So the minutes don't concern me, even if they drop. So there's definitely value in the time that he plays. So objectively, they want to come out, put their foot on the opponent's throat, and then if they're sitting the entire fourth quarter, that's fine. That's how you kind of mitigate a lot of Steph's minutes. What's concerning to me is his shooting percentages the last 2 seasons. Now, yes, of course, they went through that rut before they won the championship where it was just really, really bad. Teams loaded up on Steph, and he kind of had a rough go of it. He didn't have a ton of help. Clay's back. The emergence of Jordan Poole, which is, you know, we didn't talk much about that one as well, but from a guard perspective, there's flexibility in Golden State for both Clay and Steph. So I see scenarios in which his minutes are mitigated, but I don't think it'll be at the start of games. I don't think it'll be on back-to-backs. I don't think it's going to be anything like that as far as load management. I think it's going to be, let's go out, let's run roughshod on them with the objective to get our young guys in the full second half of the game so they're ready for playoffs. So the field goal percentages and the three-point percentages is what I would concern myself. And surprisingly, the three-point attempts dipped last season for Steph. So I don't know if that's a trend. The way that he plays the game, it'll allow him to age a little bit better than, say, somebody Chris Paul, who we kind of talked about earlier, who just kind of took a bang to his body just being in the paint consistently over the last 18 years. So where I see a little bit of a drop-off, I don't see it being drastic. And I think it is one of those things where you can't not take him if he's still there as the eighth point guard, just because his ability to get hot quick. So I think this is a good spot for him.
Well, and I have him ranked a little bit higher than I do our number 7 player here, and that's Ja Morant. So we talk about players being better in reality than fantasy. If fantasy basketball was predicated on taking the most talented players and just plugging them in, you would be hard pressed to find more than a handful of guys who are better than this kid. He has been unbelievable since he came into the league. You're talking about a player with elite scoring ability. Field goal percentage is solid. His ability to get to the rack and finish is nearly unparalleled. He's going to get you a ton of assists, and he's going to get you a ton of points. So Morant's one of those players, though, who the other counting stats are just not really there when it comes to steals and blocks. He still turns over the ball a lot. Rebounds are decent, but not anything crazy. And his free throw percentage just isn't very good. I'm interested to see just kind of what he plays in terms of number of games again. He's a guy who just his style of play lends itself to getting nicked up because he is so aggressive and so physical. He is fun to watch. He's fun to have on your fantasy team. I'm hard pressed to put him in the top 5, but certainly, he's one of the better point guards in the league and in fantasy as well. Thoughts on Ja?
This is one of those guys that he's definitely going to get overdrafted, in my opinion, off of name value. He's a fun watch, especially for younger players in your league, like younger individuals who are in your fantasy league. I mean, he's one of the most popular players in the league, and sometimes people will take flyers out on guys earlier than they should. He reminds me a lot of Allen Iverson. He reminds me a lot of Dwayne Wade. He reminds me a lot of Isaiah Thomas when he was with Boston. And these are guys that are just like constantly looking for, I'm trying to make a poster out of you. I'm trying to get to that free throw line. And for a guy who's only shooting 76%, I would hope that his game would evolve a little bit from just kind of running and trying to bury you. If you're an 85% free throw shooter, okay, that makes sense. But at 76%, the risk reward factor sometimes it's just not worth it because he really puts himself in some bad positions. And where I can appreciate it if I was an actual owner, somebody who plays through pain, he tries to play through a lot of injuries and that doesn't necessarily, there's a point of diminishing returns though, you know what I'm saying? And look, one of my least favorite players in real life is Draymond Green. But he did say something that I think is pretty poignant, and I think it's...
Well, he said a lot of things that are very poignant.
Yeah, well, I think one in particular is when he said that this is going to be the year where Memphis is going to have to kind of live up to what they did last season. Because I don't think they shocked the world by any means, but I think that they definitely kind of, they had some big boy britches on. They showed well in the playoffs. And I think it's a learning opportunity if they take those losses to Golden State as a learning opportunity. If they're cocky and arrogant and they feel like it's just a matter of time, I think they're going to have a long season because I'm not big on the Desmond Bane train. I don't think that his game is something that evolves. I think we might have seen the best Desmond Bane season we're going to see. And I'm stuck with Jaren Jackson because all of the offensive benefits and rebounding benefits and defensive benefits that he brings, the guy can't stay on the court because he's in perpetual foul trouble. So if I'm playing Memphis, I'm just going to stack the box on Ja because I know that he's stubbornly going to try to blow through that box. So enjoy Ja Morant while you can because I honestly think we've got about 3 more seasons of this until injuries are really just going to kind of be the bane of this guy's career. So he's going to be exciting. I wouldn't take him at 7 personally. I think there are other guys that I'd rather have here just because he makes me nervous every time he attacks the basket. So I'd probably be a little bit lower on him, but he will be overdrafted because of his name. So that could really play in your favor in fantasy leagues.
Let's move on and talk about one of my personal favorite players right now in fantasy in terms of value, and that's Tyrese Halliburton of the Indiana Pacers. It was really kind of an under the radar move in a lot of respects, I guess, just kind of maybe in reality and realistically, you're talking about Indiana and Sacramento, 2 teams that weren't really going anywhere last year. But the trade that sent Domantas Sabonis to Sacramento in exchange for Tyrese Halliburton was significant, especially with Malcolm Brogdon gone now. So Halliburton has a chance to really establish himself as the guy in Indiana. And he's a player who has the skill set to be able to do that. He's a great scorer. He's going to be great on the assist front. He's going to get you a handful of rebounds and blocks. I think he's a player who's going to blossom and really turn into one of those all-star level point guards. His usage rate is going to go off the charts now. He is going to be the A1 alpha big dog for this Indiana Pacers team for sure. So I think that he's one of those players who you look at players like Darius Garland and DeJounte Murray, and some of these others who they hit last year and they just really outplayed their ADP. And I think Halliburton is one of those players who this year is just primed to do that, because again, people in your league are going to go for name value and they're going to take other players like Kyrie Irving or Ja Morant or some of these other players who they like to see on TV, on Christmas Day. But Halliburton is not going to be the household name that's going to be the sexiest pick out there, but I think he's going to provide major value. And at the end of the season, here's my bold prediction. Okay. There are going to be players who are consistently on winning rosters. And I think Halliburton is going to be one of those players who's on a whole heck of a lot of championship rosters this year. What do you think of Tyrese?
Yeah, I agree. So he's going to get underdrafted in leagues where people are not savvy. He's going to get overdrafted in leagues where the hot take is take Halliburton because he's the next big thing. So it just really depends on the league that you're in. But from a statistical standpoint, where he reminds me of, so I think ultimately he'll end up being the face of Indiana. I think they still have Miles Turner. They still have Buddy Hield. I don't know what the plan is for them. If they end up playing well the first half of the season, they may reconsider whether or not they look to move those two guys. Because I think Halliburton, he's another one of those guys. I like the word malleable because you can put him in a lot of different positions. He can guard 1 through 4. He doesn't bitch, he doesn't gripe, he doesn't turn the ball over. He's very smart. He reminds me of that first All-Star season that Steve Nash had in Dallas, where it was pass first. He could score when he needed to. He's got to have high percentages and splits, and I think those are going to continue to improve. I think he is a very efficient player. I don't know that he's going to be the A1 where he's taking 17, 18, 19 shots a game like DeJounte Murray was doing in San Antonio. I just don't see that being in his DNA unless he absolutely has to. So, this is one of those teams that I think is racing to the bottom. But from a statistical standpoint, I think he walks into several 9-cat league stats, and he peppers the stat sheet. So I love him in fantasy. I would love to have him on a team, and I would be pleased to see his game kind of evolve like Steve Nash did. And there's some striking parallels if you go back from the statistical standpoint of what Halliburton did his first 2 years in the season, and then when Nash really kind of came in his own the first couple of years in Dallas leading up to him being an all-star. So he's got to be overdrafted in some leagues, in the heady leagues, quote unquote, and he's got to be underdrafted in the leagues where guys are doing it based on name value. So, yeah, you have an opportunity to really steal one here, depending on the league you're in.
Well, we're going to move on to our top 5 now, and at 5, it's going to be Trae Young of the Atlanta Hawks, and we know what Trae's all about after, just seeing his evolution over the last few years. This is again where you and I are going to differ a little bit. I think that DeJounte Murray is going to siphon some of the value off of Trae. I think that Trae is, obviously, when you look at things from a talent perspective, there are a few players who have more talent than Trae Young does. This is a player who came out of Oklahoma, and people thought, well, maybe hit and miss. We're not really sure. He did some amazing things for the Sooners, but could that really translate? Well, it's translated. There's no question about that. This is a scoring machine. Okay, so the question is going to be now, what does he do with 3, 4, 5 fewer shots now that Murray's there? So, you're going to get threes, you're going to get points, you're going to get assists, but what do those numbers really look like? I'm thinking it's going to be more like 27 and 9, which you look at on the surface. That's fantastic. If you can get a point guard on your fantasy team that give you 27 points and 9 assists, it's going to be pretty amazing. But even for Young, though, it's a little bit less than what we've come to expect or want from him. So he's certainly still a top 5 level player. I just don't know that he's going to be able to produce those nuclear nights on a consistent basis like what we're used to seeing from him in the past. I do think that the addition of Murray is going to extend his career a little bit. Certainly going to take some of the load off of him, but I do wonder just what that's going to take off of him in terms of his counting stats.
Yeah, I think the biggest drop for Trae is going to be on the assist side, because if they want to continue to be, a top 6 team in the East, in pressure situations, I trust that ball in DeJounte Murray's hands more than I trusted in Trey to make the right decision. And I think it's just a matter of time before they kind of realize that. So that doesn't mean that Trey's not going to get his touches. I mean, he averaged just under 21 shots a game last year. I don't really see that I definitely don't see it being curtailed by 5 shots. I could see him run that 18, just right around 18. So you're giving up 2 shots. I think you're going to see Clint Capella only shooting if they're dumps at the basket and things like that. So definitely more 3 opportunities with DeJounte on there. As long as his percentages are in line, I'm not really thinking that his points per game are going to drop that much. I just think from the assist standpoint, he's going to have more opportunities with the ball not in his hands. Because he's quick, he does a good job of coming off his screens. He's got a very fast release, and I think contrast that to DeJounte, who doesn't have a quick release, and he hasn't been in a situation where he's had to play off the ball. So that just makes sense long term for it to be in DeJounte's hands more. So from a usage perspective, I mean, Trey's top 10 in like percentage of possession in the league. That is going to be different for him, but I think that he will be able to thrive there. So defensive stats, they weren't great to begin with. I think those all but disappear. And I think it's going to be very tough for him to have, nearly 10 assists a game with DeJounte. I just think the offense will be initiated through DeJounte more than it'll be through Trey later in the season. So I don't see a huge drop off, but like I said, I definitely wouldn't take Trey this high. There's 3 other point guards that I'd probably take above Trey personally, but I don't think he's going to get just completely sideswiped, but he will see a pretty good pullback, because when you're flirting with 10 assists, that means you're having the double-double multiplier multiple times. So he's had games over 10. When you lose that multiplier, in addition to the assist points, now you're talking, it could be a pretty significant on a week basis where they play 4 games. That's a pretty good drop-off. You know what I'm saying? So that's where I go back to. I think his game is hurt more by DeJounte coming on than DeJounte's game is hurt by Trey, just because there's more flexibility in how DeJounte plays and gets his stats than Trey's. But that's just me personally.
Well, I mean, you've been wrong many times, so I guess we'll just kind of see what happens moving forward. It's going to be one of those storylines to watch. There's no question about it, whether it's Mitchell and Garland or Young and DeJounte. I think it's going to be fun to watch. So let's talk about some of those point guards that you might take even ahead of him in drafts. And for those of you guys who don't know, which is mostly all of you, James and I do live in the Northwest, so we have lived through a lot of Portland Trailblazer heartache. We've lived through the Sam Bowie years and the Greg Oden years and a lot of lean years out there. And a player came along not too long ago who has really kind of captured the the hearts of the Blazer faithful. And he's poised for a bounce back season for sure. And that's none other than Damian Lillard. So you look at Dame, and he is just such a grinder, and obviously last year did not go well. He missed most of the season. That allowed Portland to, score Shaedon Sharpe in the draft, and we'll talk about his potential later on down the road. But Dame is one of those players who, well, yes, he's aging. He's just such a smooth player, and someone who he can get his shot against anybody whenever he wants. The field goal percentage is going to be below average. We know that, just because of the volume of difficult shots that he takes, be that from 2 steps inside half court or wherever. But you know that you're going to get a lot of makes. And I know that he had a little bit of a down year prior to the injury. But you talk about players who are set to go nuclear in kind of a comeback, bounce back season. You mentioned the FU season that you expected from Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving. I expect a huge one from Dame as well, and it's just going to benefit fantasy players across the board.
Yeah, I mean, this is no slight to Norman Powell, but he was actually just a 2. He never really was a true 3. Dame hasn't had a solid 3 small forward since he's been in Portland. I mean, that from an offensive standpoint, you could take the load off. And because, one of those things as a Blazer fan, and some of that will bleed into our conversations, but, when we had Nick Batum all those years, this is a guy who was just loaded with talent but never maximized it. And that was very, very frustrating as a fan. So a lot of that burden was put on Dame and CJ, and there were a lot of redundancies in their game. And one of my concerns for Portland moving forward is that I don't see a huge difference or an upgrade from Anthony Simons and CJ from a statistical standpoint and what they bring. But where I see benefits moving forward, and I would not argue that these are saving your franchise player moves, which is what a lot of the hype was the last year and a half when it came to Dame staying in Portland. I don't think Jeremy Grant is that type of player, but what he is an offensive capable guy who removes the likelihood of being a double team late in the shot clock, which is when there's 8 seconds on that shot clock if the play blows up and the Dame's forced to shoot that 3-pointer from 6 feet behind the line. Yes. Is he capable of hitting it? Yes. But he's shooting 32% from the field or 3-point line last season. He needs that to be closer to 38%, and he can't do that if they're throwing a double team on him with 7 seconds left on the clock. With Jeremy Grant, that doesn't happen. He's a willing passer, 7.3 assists in the short period of time he was there last season. Anthony Simons is a scoring machine, and Jeremy Grant gets downhill. And I think Nurkic is another guy who is like, a lot of people just kick him, and I've been one as a Blazer fan. I don't think you need Nurkic to give you something crazy, to give you a double-double every night and to put this team in a position to be in that 6-7 seed in the West. So I 100% agree. I think Dame thinks his body's right. His mind's always been right. He's arguably the best leader in the NBA. Don't at me. He's said it, and I've heard him speak, and I've watched him in interviews, and I've watched his demeanor on the court time and time again that no one's going to ever tell me that he's not the best leader in the NBA. And I think he's going to look to remind people that he's definitely a top 10 player in this league. I actually think he's going to be in the running for the scoring leader this year. So it could be a pretty good season for him. Statistically speaking, he does enough in the other categories that if he gets his percentages back up, he's going to be a top 5 for sure, point guard.
Yeah, I don't think there's any question about it. That's just the way he's going to operate. So one of the advantages or fun things about following players as closely as we do is you get to know about their personal life and their family. And this is going to bring us to our number 3 point guard, who we found over the last 5-6 years has a dad who's really grounded, really soft-spoken, very quiet, not somebody who wants any sort of attention. And that is, of course, LaMelo Ball. So we all know the story about the Ball family and their escapades in California. And I still remember seeing highlights of the 91-point game that LaMelo had in high school where basically nobody guarded him. I was skeptical about just what kind of player LaMelo was going to be coming into the league. Frankly, I didn't think he was mentally tough enough to be able to handle the NBA. I thought that his talent would have a hard time translating. I didn't think he was going to be able to shoot the ball well enough to be effective. I just thought that the baggage that came with him was just going to be too much. And we said it at the beginning of the show, there are going to be times where we're wrong. And I was wrong about LaMelo. I was right about Lonzo. I was certainly wrong about LaMelo because he really has become one of the league's great young superstars. Now, the shooting percentage hasn't translated as well as what he'd like. You're talking about a guy who's going to shoot somewhere around 43% or so. Free throw percentage is still going to be solid. He's going to make a ton of threes. He's going to score the basketball. The reason why he's valuable in fantasy is his ability to pick up statistics in other ways, be that rebounds, assists, steals. You're talking about a guy who across the board is either very good or elite in just about every statistical category outside of field goal percentage and turnovers. And even that, it's not egregious. But he's going to be one of those players who's consistently going to put up great numbers, all-star level performer numbers, moving forward, into the near future. I think that we do have some questions in terms of what happens. We followed the Miles Bridges story, which is just bizarre. Montrezl Harrell's gone. What really happens with LaMelo? I think that there's been nothing but positives, and I think he's primed to take yet another step here in 2022. Do you agree, James?
Yeah, so what I love about LaMelo Ball, he's like Anthony Edwards in the fact that he kind of comes onto the scene and you assume as a fan that there's a process where you have to grind and you have to bust your ass and you have to put in the sweat and you have to put the hours in the dark gym and you have to lift the weights. And then you get these guys who come along and they just kind of pick up a ball and they just do it. And they do it really freakishly well, and it's effortless. And they almost come across as disrespectful to the grind that we talked about with Damian Lillard and the process that it takes to kind of cultivate, a body of work into being a great player. And LaMelo, I think that's what the rub against him and his entire family is we saw the prime time, we saw the flash, but we never saw like the grind that it took to get there. And I'm not saying that he didn't put that in. Obviously, you don't get to the level that he's at right now. Same thing with Anthony Edwards without putting that time in. But I think there's a resentment to the fact that when you watch somebody, not to compare the two, but like take a Dame Lillard and you realize, well, that guy busted his hump at Weber State, and that he busted his hump his first, 4 seasons in Portland. And we haven't seen LaMelo have to work. And we haven't seen Anthony Edwards have to work. It's just kind of come easy, almost to the point where it's with Anthony Edwards, it's almost to where he laughs at this is the NBA. I thought it'd be harder. You know what I'm saying? So he's a joy to watch. He's frustrating to watch all in the same time. And this season, I think we're going to see him be challenged in this instance. With Miles being gone, Miles was their best defensive player. That's huge. And I'm looking at this roster for Charlotte, and they are going to be garbage defensively. So they're going to need to run and gun and score downhill. Terry Rozier, Kelly Oubre, they're going to have to get out and run. And Mason Plumlee, who's played on every team in the league, at least one of the Plumlee brothers have. There's a 5 times fast. But this guy can fill the stat sheet in any way possible. I'd like to see him step his game up defensively because he's got to be tasked with guarding the best offensive guard. I mean, I'm looking at the roster. They have nobody else to throw at him, which is actually pretty shocking, to be honest with you. So that Bridges loss is going to be huge. So there's a little bit of adversity here. Offensively, he's got to get his shots. I think he's still in his heart. He's a pass-first point guard who's capable of scoring. So from a stat standpoint and a fantasy standpoint, he's relatively healthy. He's got to get a ton of opportunities, and he's got the green light whenever he wants. So you have to snag him from a fantasy standpoint. You may push him down the line if you're an actual GM, but if he's sitting after 3-point guards are picked and you don't take him, you're going to be sadly mistaken because the guy he's a stat hound.
Well, you mentioned the Plumlee brothers, and wouldn't you think, like, if you're a PA announcer, like maybe the normal PA announcer gets sick, and so, this is like a dream of mine, I guess, and they just select you from the crowd and you just go and sit at the scorer's table. It's probably a safe bet if there's like a 7-foot 1-inch white guy that's either Plumlee or Lopez, one of the two, and you just shout it out and cross your fingers and you think that it's probably one of those two guys. So let's
hold on before we leave here just for a second. I'm looking at the roster for Charlotte, and these are their guards, and this is point guards and shooting guards. So they got James Bouknight, a rookie, right, at 196.4. So he's gonna need a little bit of body weight. He's gonna need a little bit of time. You've got LaMelo. You've got Scotty Lewis from Florida. You've got Bryce McGowens from Nebraska. I can't tell you that I've heard of him. They've got Kelly Oubre listed as a shooting guard, and I think the only reason why they have that is because they don't have and Terry Rozier. They are so anemically thin in the backcourt that if LaMelo Ball isn't getting 18 shots, I'd be sadly. I mean, it'll just be a travesty, a Greek travesty. So this Charlotte roster, I mean, I'm literally at a loss for words right now at the lack of depth that they have from the guard position. So God help them if anything happens to LaMelo, because they might be on the running real quick for that first pick.
They very well could. I do think that there are times where you tend to exaggerate a little bit, and calling it, I mean, isn't it more of an American tragedy? I mean, is it really a Greek tragedy? Like, you had to throw a totally different country. They don't have a single guy from Greece on their roster, but here you are, trying to throw out, like, a real Greek tragedy. I find myself shaking my head a little bit and thinking that those listening are probably saying, you know what, James, like, it's a little much. Like this, it's an American tragedy. It's just a little much for us.
I'll try to keep my patriotism in line moving forward.
Please do. Please do. All right, 2 guys left, and I think most people probably know exactly who they're going to be.
I'm actually thinking people might be willing to push back on who we have at number 2.
They might, and it's going to be interesting though, because I think some people may look at it and think that there's a case to make him number 1, and there are others who are going to look at this and think, oh, there's no way I would have this guy in my top 2. So I think that there are going to be some really strong, varying opinions about our second ranked player at point guard, and that's going to be James Harden of the Sixers. Everybody knows the story of Harden. Okay. So obviously when he was in Houston in his heyday, there were few other players, if any, that you would want on a fantasy basketball roster because he just raked. He was an unbelievable scorer, and he could just put up statistics that were ungodly crazy. And since that time, he's bounced around the league a little bit. We know it didn't work out in Brooklyn, even though he wanted it to. You know, certainly that just went sour in a hurry, where Harden and Irving and Durant, I think they played together less than 15 times total, which is just, it's unfathomable to think that. But he wanted out, and they got him out, traded him for Ben Simmons and a whole bunch of other stuff. And last year in Philadelphia, I think that he just kind of lost his way a little bit. In the playoffs, it was a total debacle. You look at what's happened to the Sixers in the last couple of years. They had Ben Simmons, who didn't want to shoot, and James Harden, who just refused to. It was weird. There's no question about it. I think there were some questions about his durability. I think there were some questions about his weight, frankly. His shooting percentages were awful, but when he's right, he can put up some crazy, crazy statistics. And from everything you read, and granted, there are a zillion off-season fluff pieces about just about every player, but when you hear it as much as we have, and you read it as much as we have, you start buying into it. And even an out-of-shape Harden rolls out of bed and can get you enough points to feel good about it. But a prime Harden playing with Embiid in a pick and roll system, he could put up some ungodly crazy numbers again. So you're looking at a player here who, you know, his field goal percentage continues to dip a little bit, but he's going to make free throws. He's going to make threes. He's going to score the ball. It's not going to be his 35, 36 points a game. I mean, it's going to be more like 22 or 23, but you know, you're going to get assists. I mean, it's very possible he's going to lead the league in assists again. He's going to turn over the ball a little bit more than you like, but it's just, you're going to get nitpicky with him. And I think that he's a player who you look at and it's really easy to, or frankly, it's easy to not like him. I think that both Harden and Irving have this kind of dislikability, if that's a word. And that kind of steers some fantasy managers away. But Harden's a guy who, if he's right, there isn't a draft slot that's too high to take him.
Yeah, I think some of the pushback will be, whether or not he's a top 5 point guard moving forward. He walks into stats, and that's the thing is, when I look at a guy from a fantasy perspective, I take a guy based on how difficult is it for him to kind of pepper the stat sheet. So that's what makes somebody like Steph and Kyrie, for instance, they've always been high ranking players, is because it's effortless for them to walk into 25 points. And I think even with how this roster is comprised moving forward, they've made a couple changes. I think that the Anthony Melton signing is going to be huge, because from a defensive standpoint, I think that's where you're going to see the biggest drop off from James, because he's never really been a big defensive guy to begin with. He is sneakily good with getting his hand in attack lanes. So he's always had 1.2 steals. I think those days might be gone just because he's going to be guarding the weakest player on the floor with you got Matisse Thybulle in there. I think DeAnthony Melton will be out there as a better defender. So I don't think he's going to be asked to take any burden defensively. And I think offensively he realizes if he doesn't win a ring, he does not want to be the guy like Charles Barkley. I think it'll eat at him if he walks away from this without a ring. And I think that he, there's something that tells me that he's looking at his legacy saying, look, I've done a lot of things personally. I've done a lot of things that have come back to bite me in the butt. I need to understand my role here. And when I look at what he can do if he understands his role, he averaged 10.5 assists last year, and that was him still trying to find his way in Philadelphia. I think when him and Embiid were running their pick-and-roll option, they were absolutely unstoppable. So I don't have the stat tracks on me, but their percentage of completion on their pick and roll game, it was like 35% of the time it led to a basket or led to a foul. Like that's a pretty high percentage when you consider a lot of those pick options lead to a kick out to a three or the play getting reset. So he's got to stay in the top 5 in assists. I could actually see him leading the league in assists this season. He averaged 21 points in assists, and then he wasn't 100% comfortable last year. And I think people still expected him to get around defenders. I think he knows better. So I would imagine his 3-point percentages are going, or 3-point field goal attempts are going to go up this year. So maybe not 21 points a game, but I don't think it's going to drop much more than 18.5. I think he leads the league in assists this year, is at least fighting for it. Rebounds, he's very instinctual. He's in the right place at the right time. So those 7.1 rebounds aren't for him going and attacking them. He's just in the right place when it comes off the bounce. So that doesn't drop to me. And I think it'd be hard-pressed to find him have a worse shooting season than he did last year. 40% from the field, 33 from 3. So if he's right and his percentages go up a little bit, he's still going to be a top 5. And he does have top 2 point guard potential on this Philadelphia team, and there's no incentive to rest him. So Daryl Morey's not going to be in a situation where we're doing load management with him. They haven't done it with Joel with his injury history. So I think he has a big season.
I do too. And and granted, we can't get inside of his mind to see exactly what he's thinking, but we've seen this a lot with players who are aging. And it's kind of ironic because sometimes age kind of turns you into a kid again. So when you're a kid growing up playing basketball, you dream of hoisting that trophy up and becoming a world champion. And I think for a lot of these guys, when they get in the league, they get paid, they make all-star teams, they go to the Olympics for some of them, they get all these personal accolades, but then they start thinking, okay, I want this one thing that's been so elusive to me. And whether that's Karl Malone or Gary Payton or Patrick Ewing or Charles Barkley, the ring chasers out there. And Harden very well could be at that ring chaser stage of his career, and it could help him mature a little bit into a better player. We know that he has talent. We know that last year was the floor, and even last year his floor was still pretty doggone good. So that's going to bring us to our number 1 point guard. I know it's the player that both of us think could be the MVP of the National Basketball Association this year, and that's Luka Doncic of the Mavericks. This is a player like no other. I think that you look at whether it's Nikola Jokic of the Nuggets or Luka with Dallas, they are just transcendently talented players who just do things that other people can't. You know, we talked a little bit about Kyrie Irving and his ability to get to the basket because he was such an elite ball handler. I've seen Luka play in person a few times, and from a coaching perspective, from a basketball perspective, I marvel at his ability to get to the ring whenever he wants to. And he doesn't do it by going through the legs and behind the back and trying to do things, fancy, breaking people's ankles. He does it by changing the pace of his dribble and by using his body as a weapon. And he does it better than anybody I've ever seen. Now, it helps when you're as big as he is, because he is a big guy. But this is a player who is an absolute superstar in fantasy and in real life. There's no question about it. You look at some of the statistics that Russell Westbrook put up in his prime, and you can argue about, how great Westbrook was from a reality standpoint. Westbrook's counting stats always outweighed things, and it made him a better fantasy player than he probably was in real life. But Luka's one of those rare players who is elite both ways. Now, you'd like to see him shoot a little bit better from the free throw line, but again, you're being pretty nitpicky with him. Luka Doncic could be the next player who averages a triple-double, and his ability to put up massive amounts of points, rebounds, and assists, to me, makes him not just the number one point guard, but the number one overall player in fantasy, next to Nikola Jokic.
Yeah, I mean, everything you said I agree with. I think he is going to win the MVP this year. I think the offseason moves, I was never a big Jalen Brunson guy. I think that he kind of mucked up the offense in Dallas, because Luka is best when he has the ball in his hands. And I know it's not dissimilar to how James Harden was in Houston. There's actually so many similarities to their game. It's ridiculous. They both used their body well. They could get to the basket whenever they wanted. They got to the free throw line whenever they wanted. But all of that was predicated on them having the ball in their hands. And with Brunson, they tried to kind of go this traditional point guard method. Luka did a lot of standing around. It just didn't suit him. So to move him and to move on from him, and not to necessarily replace him with this player, but the addition of Christian Wood. So in my opinion, as far as offseason moves, this is going to end up being, I think this will go down as the biggest home run. And that's over and above Murray to the Hawks. That's over and above Mitchell to Cleveland. Just because he's the perfect player for what Luka does, which is get out and run. He sets hard screens. He's not going to let anybody dick with him, because part of the reason why Luka's shooting 74% is because when he gets fouled, I mean, he is put down. And that's part of the reason why he has to stay as big as he is, because he plays with his body, a lot of physicality.
Do we need to contact the FCC because of the word that you just used? Like, I mean, I think it's a little out there. I don't think that we can say people are going to dick with him. Can we say that on the air? I don't know if we can say. Can we say that?
Yes, I think we can say.
Okay.
You were throwing me for a second because I didn't know what I said. Okay. But he is the perfect fit. And my only concern with Luka for the next probably 5-6 years is he's going to need to find a way to, because his stats, like you were talking about with Russell Westbrook, a lot of it was when defenses said, when he was in Oklahoma City, we are just going to throw everybody in the kitchen sink at Russell Westbrook. Well, there's inevitably going to be someone who's wide open, and all you got to do is finish a lay-in, right? So those were necessity assists, the necessity of being triple teamed and double teamed. He needs to find ways to continue to get that ball out. I actually think he's going to be closer to 10 assists this year with Christian Wood, because he's an excellent dump rim runner. And I think with the ball in his hands, now that you take Brunson out of the mix, I think his assists are going to go up. Scoring, he's going to walk into 28 points any day of the week. Rebounds, I mean, I don't really see the needle moving. It's kind of been up and down, 9-4, 8, 9-1. So, I mean, I say that being consistent. From a field goal perspective, 45% from a guy who is facing a double team, probably 60% of his possessions. I think that's pretty fantastic. So I don't anticipate much higher production, but from a fantasy perspective, he's top 2 in the league, top 3 if you take Giannis into account, as is right now. And I think he has the opportunity to flirt with the assist title this year. I think he walks away as the MVP. I think he walks away with top 3 value in the league in fantasy. He logs a lot of minutes, and he plays. And the thing about it is, it's almost counterintuitive in today's society, because from a fantasy perspective, you don't want a guy like this to get hurt because he's your cash cow, right? He's played in 72, 61, 66, and 65. We're in a day and age where that's almost unheard of from a star player, So it's almost like, man, I kind of wish they would rest him a little bit. So because he plays 35, 34, 33 minutes a game, where a lot of these guys are playing 28. So he's been playing pro ball since he was 16 years old. So when we look at his actual age, which I'm looking here, I don't have to off the top of my head. So he was born in 99. So that puts him at what, 33 years old?
Well, yeah, because we were born right around that time too, right? Right around 99, 2000. Yeah, we started playing pro ball around 12.
So, I mean, if you think about it from him playing at 16 years old, that's a lot. I mean, that's a lot of wear and tear. I'm not saying prepare for it to break. I think this is actually probably going to be, we're at the precipice of him being full star power. You know what I'm saying? He's almost got all the Infinity Stones. So you can't not take him. I guess the only question you have is if you've got Jokic, Giannis, and Luka, and you're the number one pick. I mean, that's a good problem to have, I guess.
Yeah, it's not a bad one, that's for sure. So that really takes us all the way through the list of top point guards. We're going to come back next episode, talk about shooting guards. This was a long one. This shows won't normally be this long, but I think we're excited to share some information with folks and talk a lot of fantasy hoops. It's what we love to do. All we're doing now is just kind of hitting the record button. So it's kind of what we tended to kind of do in the first place. So this has been fun for sure. So any parting thoughts from you, James, before we call it a night?
No, I think it's going to be an exciting season. I think point guards are such a high value target when it comes to these drafts. So you want to make sure that you pick soundly. But if you're going to make a splash on one, make sure you have a safety pick for your backup. Somebody who's going to get you plenty of games, someone who kind of peppers the sheet in multiple categories, just to play it safe, because you don't want to be that guy who drafts power forwards and centers the entire league or entire first 5 rounds and then find out that there's nothing left but scraps when it comes to the point guard position. There's just too much value there.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. Okay, so that's going to do it for episode 1 of the Fantasy Basketball Podcast. So follow us on Twitter, perhaps. That'd be great. Okay, we'll see you next time.